Zira's spacecraft touched down on Earth with a soft thud, its sleek alien design shimmering under the sunlight. As the doors opened, Zira stepped out, her posture regal and precise, her every movement calculated. She was a dignitary from a highly advanced civilization, sent on a diplomatic mission to Earth. Her people had never encountered a species like humans, and they had little understanding of Earth's customs, particularly the less formal, playful side of human behavior. She had studied the mission brief thoroughly, expecting a series of formal events, meetings, discussions, perhaps some cultural exchange, all conducted with the highest degree of professionalism. She was met by a human guide named Marco. He was nothing like the dignitaries she had expected. He was loud. His smile seemed permanently fixed on his face, and there was a glint in his eyes that made her feel both uneasy and intrigued. He extended his hand. "Welcome to Earth, Zira. I'm Marco, your human guide. I'm here to show you all the sights, sounds, and cultural practices this planet has to offer." Zira hesitated, unsure of whether to shake his hand. She had read that humans preferred this gesture, but she wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Still, she knew it was part of the formality, so she offered her hand, her fingers stiff. Marco gave her a firm shake and grinned wider. "Great! Let's get started," he said. "First stop, the official Earth cultural greeting." Zira raised an eyebrow. "Official greeting?" She had imagined some sort of grand ceremony, perhaps with intricate rituals involving speech, hand movements, or symbolic gestures. Marco's grin only widened. "Exactly! The club is the traditional place for this," Marco said, leading her toward a dark, noisy building. Zira's eyes widened as she saw the neon lights flashing in the windows, the loud thumping of bass reverberating through her chest. "It's like a celebration of everything humans hold dear," Marco explained, pushing open the door. Inside, the scene was a far cry from the dignified events she had prepared for. The air was thick with sweat, the lights blinding, and humans were moving. The sound of rhythmic beats filled the room, accompanied by half-dressed people swaying in time with the music. Zira blinked several times, her eyes adjusting to the madness. Her chest tightened. Was this the Earth greeting ceremony? Were these the formal dancers of their culture? She wasn't sure, but she wasn't going to let her confusion show. She turned to Marco. "Is this really legal?" Marco's grin turned into a mischievous smirk. "Totally legal. It's how we greet dignitaries on Earth. Now let's see how well you can dance." He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the middle of the floor. The music vibrated her bones, and people around her danced without inhibition, moving their bodies in ways Zira had never seen before. She had no idea what was happening, but she couldn't back down now. Her alien instincts kicked in, and she tried to mimic the moves of the others, but her movements were stiff, calculated, awkward. She flailed about, trying to match the rhythm. To her horror, Marco's laughter reached her ears. It wasn't cruel, but it was unmistakably amused. His voice was barely audible over the music, but she could still hear his teasing. "Look at you go, Zira! You're doing something all right." Zira stiffened, feeling her alien body twist in strange ways. This was not how she had imagined introducing herself to Earth. She was supposed to observe, not partake in something as chaotic as this. She glanced at Marco, trying to understand what was happening. His grin was only getting bigger. "Marco, I'm afraid I am not understanding," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the thumping bass. "Is this some kind of test?" He leaned closer, his voice teasing but full of mischief. "You're doing great, Zira. Just let go a little more. I promise you, humans do this all the time." "Is this really legal?" she asked again, this time genuinely curious. She had seen humans move their bodies in ways that seemed both unnatural and intimate. Zira wondered if it was all sanctioned behavior, but Marco didn't seem to care. He was enjoying himself far too much. Marco chuckled. "Oh yeah, it's completely legal. Humans just like to have fun. But hey, if you're not enjoying it, we can always try something else." Zira's mind whirled. Fun. The concept was strange. As a diplomat, she had been trained to understand all the formalities and intricacies of various cultures, but fun? It was beyond her comprehension. Yet, she couldn't deny that a part of her, something foreign and unexpected, was beginning to enjoy the absurdity of the situation. Despite herself, she couldn't help but let loose a little. She started moving her body in more exaggerated ways, following Marco's lead, but she was still struggling. Her movements were stiff and mechanical, clearly not in tune with the carefree abandon of the humans around her. Marco, noticing her discomfort, gave her a playful wink. "You're almost there, Zira. Just try to forget about your formal training for a second. Have some fun with it. Let's see if you can keep up with me." Zira's brow furrowed. "You think I cannot keep up?" Marco's grin widened. "Let's find out." Before she could protest, Marco grabbed her by the hand and pulled her into another round of chaotic dancing. This time, Zira let herself follow his lead more freely. The music pulsated through her, and despite her best efforts to remain dignified, she found herself laughing, something she had never done before. Laughter. Was that also legal? In the midst of her disorientation and unexpected joy, Zira found herself becoming more aware of the human customs she had so eagerly been sent to observe. This was fun. And while she was still trying to wrap her mind around the chaos of it all, she knew one thing for certain: Earth was nothing like her home. This planet was unpredictable. "Marco," Zira said, breathless from her attempt at dancing, "I'm starting to think you're not taking this mission seriously." He grinned wider. "Oh, I'm taking it very seriously. You're just not getting it yet." He pulled her even closer, and for a brief moment, Zira's rigid alien composure cracked. She was no longer the formal diplomat. She was a participant in something much, much stranger than she had ever imagined. And yet she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement, something she had never thought to associate with her role. Zira's lips parted, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully experience the moment. "This is fun," she whispered under her breath, not quite sure whether she was speaking to herself or Marco. Marco, ever the instigator, leaned in closer, his voice low and teasing. "I told you so. Now, Zira, get ready for the real Earth fun. We're just getting started." And so, with the loud beat of human music surrounding them, Zira's journey into the realm of Earth's strange pleasures had officially begun. Zira's experience on Earth was becoming increasingly perplexing. After the nightclub incident, Marco seemed to be on a mission to subject her to every possible form of human entertainment that strayed far from the serious, diplomatic environment she was accustomed to. The next day, Marco announced their next stop, an educational visit to a strip club. "Isn't there another way to educate me?" Zira asked, eyeing Marco skeptically as they stood outside a neon-lit building with flashing signs. It looked nothing like the dignified halls of cultural learning she had imagined Earth to be full of. She had been trained to observe the deep philosophical aspects of other species, not whatever this place represented. Marco, however, was grinning ear to ear. "Trust me, Zira, you'll learn more about human culture here than you will from any academic paper. You see, strip clubs are, well, let's just say they're a unique form of human art. A way of expressing sensuality." He nudged her playfully. "Come on, trust me." Zira crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced, but she followed him inside, though not without a heavy sigh. What she saw inside was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The dimly lit space pulsed with heavy bass, and humans were sitting around, sipping drinks while women performed on stage, moving with an almost hypnotic fluidity. Zira blinked in confusion. What do you call this, Marco?" "This is the art of human entertainment," Marco said with a wink. "And you're going to love it." Zira was having trouble processing the scene. Humans were so free in their expression. It was jarring, almost alarming, to witness such openness about something she had been taught to see as so private. Her species viewed physical contact as something sacred, reserved for only the most intimate of relationships. To see it so casually flaunted in public was both bewildering and oddly fascinating. Zira's confusion must have been apparent on her face because Marco's eyes glinted with mischief. It's fine, he reassured her. Just relax and take it in. No one's going to bite. Well, not literally. She stared at him, eyes narrowed. I don't think I should be here. This seems to be in violation of several protocols. Ha! Marco laughed. Yeah, well, Earth doesn't have protocols like your species. This is fun, remember? She frowned, uncomfortable. Is this how Earthlings express their culture? By performing acts of what you call entertainment. Exactly. It's an expression of freedom, Zira. The freedom to do whatever the heck you want without judgment. The freedom to have fun, no matter how strange it might seem to someone like you. Zira watched as a dancer on stage moved to the beat, her body undulating in ways Zira had never imagined a human could. The very concept of it seemed so foreign. Still, there was something fascinating about the way the humans responded. There was an energy in the room, an unspoken understanding between the performers and the audience. Zira wasn't sure if it was the music or the spectacle, but she found herself drawn in. She watched for a moment longer, her gaze flicking from the performer to Marco, who seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the scene. This is strange. Marco shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. Yeah, I guess. But it's a big part of human culture. You'll see people do a lot of weird stuff, and I'll bet this is just the tip of the iceberg. Zira's eyes darted to the stage again. The movements of the performers, though graceful, seemed to have an underlying playfulness, something deeper. She had no idea what to make of it. She didn't have words for what she was witnessing, but she had to admit it was unlike anything she had been taught about human culture. Do you understand now? Marco asked, leaning closer to her. His voice was playful, but there was a slight edge to it that Zira couldn't quite place. Humans don't hide their desires. They let them out. That's the fun. Zira's lips pressed together in thought. I think I understand. But the manner in which they express this desire seems to be very overt. Are they not concerned with the consequences? Marco chuckled. Consequences? Not really. For humans, this is normal. It's just a form of expression. No harm done. He leaned back, eyes glinting. But hey, that doesn't mean you have to join in. I was not planning on it, Zira said quickly, though a small part of her wondered what it would be like to try. To experience it, as Marco suggested. But no. She was here to observe, to remain detached and professional. But Marco wasn't finished yet. Why don't we go backstage and get a closer look at things? He suggested with a grin. Zira froze. A closer look? She echoed, feeling her cheeks flush with what she could only identify as confusion, or perhaps embarrassment. Why would I need a closer look? Marco only smiled wider, clearly enjoying her reaction. Well, you are here to learn, right? This is part of Earth culture. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions once you see how the magic happens up close. Zira didn't want to know. She was beginning to feel out of her depth. Marco, I think I've learned enough for today, she said, her tone firm. Perhaps we should move on to the next. Relax, Zira, Marco interrupted with a chuckle. I promise you'll be fine. This is part of your cultural exchange, and I'm sure you'll be fascinated. Zira's eyes narrowed. I am not so sure. But Marco's grin never faltered, and before she could protest further, he was already leading her backstage. As they walked, Zira couldn't help but feel more than a little overwhelmed. She had expected to learn about Earth's culture, but this was not what she had imagined. She had been trained to analyze human history, language, and customs, not their entertainment. This world was a far cry from what she had envisioned. And yet, there was something strangely captivating about it. Despite her confusion, a part of her was intrigued. Earth's free-spirited nature, their willingness to embrace the unexpected, the fun. It was nothing like the rigid structure of her own people. This freedom was both unsettling and strangely appealing. Marco, as usual, seemed to sense her internal conflict. You don't have to enjoy it, Zira, he said with a wink. But it's important to understand it. Fun isn't always something you can plan for. Sometimes it just happens. She looked at him, her mind racing with questions, but before she could form a response, they reached the backstage area. Zira braced herself. The next chapter of her earthly education was about to begin, and she had no idea how far Marco was willing to push her boundaries. "Let's see what they're really up to back here," Marco said, his grin only widening. Zira stood frozen, her thoughts a blur as she followed Marco into the back room of the strip club. The door swung shut behind them, muffling the loud bass from the main room. She was surrounded by human chaos. Women and men were changing outfits, applying makeup, and speaking in a language that was so full of double meanings that Zira was struggling to keep up. She felt her discomfort rise as she took in the scene. Human bodies, adorned with strange clothing and makeup, were a world apart from the perfectly composed appearance of her own species. She was used to seeing individuals maintaining a level of decorum, never indulging in excess or ostentation. Here, everything felt so different. "Why are we here, Marco?" Zira asked, her voice a mix of confusion and unease. "Isn't this inappropriate?" Marco, clearly enjoying her discomfort, flashed her a grin. "This, my dear Zira, is where the real magic happens. You wanted to learn about human culture, right? You can't learn it all from books or lectures. You have to see it for yourself." Zira's eyes narrowed. "I am learning more than I need to." Marco, unfazed, continued to lead her deeper into the area, past mirrors and curtains that separated one part of the building from another. "Don't worry. It's a controlled environment. We're just here for a behind-the-scenes tour." Zira felt her cheeks flush, and she struggled to suppress the urge to make a hasty exit. This was not how she had expected her diplomatic mission to unfold. She had been sent to Earth to observe, to learn, and to report back on human customs, not to be dragged into situations like this. And yet, here she was, in the heart of what Marco had called a cultural experience. As they walked further, she couldn't help but notice how different the people around her were. The women who worked in this space had an air of confidence that Zira had never seen before. They spoke with one another freely, laughing, joking, and occasionally making sly remarks. The entire place exuded a raw energy that made Zira feel both out of place and oddly intrigued. Marco leaned in close to Zira and whispered with a smirk. "This is what humans call personal freedom. The ability to express themselves however they see fit. A bit different from your more, reserved culture, huh?" Zira shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see how this is personal freedom. It seems more like—" She struggled for the right word. "Debauchery." "Debauchery?" Marco raised an eyebrow. "Zira, you're making it sound like it's a bad thing. You don't understand. This is fun. It's all about enjoyment, letting loose, and having a good time. No harm, no foul." Zira blinked at him, trying to wrap her mind around his explanation. She still couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Human fun seemed to be a far cry from anything her people would consider acceptable. The idea of exposing oneself in such an open and public manner was beyond her comprehension. But before she could voice more of her concerns, a woman approached them, a performer, dressed in a barely their outfit, her hair tied up in an elaborate style that Zira couldn't even begin to describe. "Marco!" the woman greeted with a smile. "I see you brought a new friend." Marco returned the smile, his eyes twinkling. "Yeah, this is Zira. She's here to learn about Earth customs." Zira found herself under the woman's curious gaze. "Earth customs?" The performer laughed. "Oh honey, you're about to learn more than you bargained for. Are you ready for a real education?" Zira's discomfort grew, but she held her ground. "I'm not sure this is appropriate." "Appropriate?" The performer looked at her, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow. "This is the fun part of Earth, sweetie. And you're not gonna find anything more real than this." Zira didn't know how to respond. She was growing increasingly aware that Earth was a place of vast contradictions. Here, what seemed improper to her was celebrated as an expression of freedom. Marco was right in a sense. It was a culture of no judgment, no restraint. Still, she wasn't sure whether to admire that or feel repelled by it. Suddenly, the performer reached forward and touched Zira's arm. Don't be shy, darling. We all have to start somewhere. Come on, let's show you the ropes. Zira took a small step back, clearly uncomfortable. I don't think that's necessary. Marco, ever the instigator, grinned. Hey, come on, Zira. You've seen a bit, haven't you? Why not get a closer look? You'll never truly understand until you experience it. I do not need to experience this to understand it, Zira replied, her voice cool and controlled, though there was an unmistakable tension in her shoulders. She wasn't about to let Marco drag her into more of these chaotic human situations. She wasn't even sure if she could keep her composure much longer. The performer gave a laugh and shrugged. Suit yourself. But don't be surprised when Earth starts looking a lot more fun to you once you let your guard down. I'll tell you one thing, no one ever leaves here without learning something new. Zira glanced at Marco, who was now looking at her with a raised eyebrow, silently challenging her to step out of her comfort zone. He was clearly enjoying her discomfort, but Zira could see something else in his expression, a sense of excitement. He wanted her to engage with the chaos, to lose her sense of decorum, to truly become a part of this world. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, Zira began to wonder if Marco had a point. This human world was absurd, yes, but it was also undeniably alive. There was an energy here, a freedom she had never known. It was alien, in the truest sense of the word, but perhaps that was part of what made it so intriguing. Marco was staring at her, waiting for her response. Zira hesitated. She wasn't sure she could abandon her dignified composure, not here, not in front of so many humans. But part of her, the part that Marco had been so persistent in drawing out, was starting to consider it. Maybe she didn't need to be so serious all the time. Maybe, just once, she could let go and experience Earth on its own terms. The thought made her uneasy, but it also made her curious. All right, she said, her voice just shy of resigned. But I will only observe. I will not participate. Marco smirked. We'll see about that. As Zira followed him, her mind raced. Was she truly ready to embrace this strange world? Or would she forever remain an outsider, just watching as the humans around her reveled in their bizarre sense of freedom? The answer wasn't clear, but she had a feeling that Earth had much more in store for her than she could possibly anticipate. Zira's discomfort was palpable as Marco guided her through the club, her mind still racing from the strange, overwhelming experience. Each step forward felt like she was being drawn deeper into a world she wasn't sure she understood. What had started as a simple diplomatic mission to observe Earth's social customs was quickly spiraling into something much more chaotic and confusing. Marco, clearly pleased by her reaction, was in his element, teasing her at every turn. It's all part of the fun, Zira, he said with a wink. You can't truly understand Earth unless you dive in head first. I am diving, Zira muttered, her eyes darting nervously from one human to the next, each of them seemingly unconcerned by the lack of decorum. But I am not sure I can breathe here. She took another step, trying to keep up with Marco as he led her through a maze of flashing lights, thumping music, and raucous laughter. Every corner they turned, every new person they encountered, seemed to reinforce the strange sense of disorientation she felt. Marco was having the time of his life, while she was a fish out of water. Eventually, they arrived at a small table at the edge of the room. The humans sitting there were all chatting and laughing, their conversations peppered with innuendo and double entendres that Zira couldn't quite wrap her head around. She wasn't sure if she was more shocked by the loose, carefree way they spoke or by the fact that they seemed so unbothered by it. Marco pulled out a chair for her and gestured for her to sit. Don't worry, just relax, he said, his tone teasing. You'll get the hang of it eventually. Zira hesitated, glancing around at the group. This is not what I expected of human customs, she said, a trace of frustration slipping into her voice. You said I would learn about your ways, but all I've learned so far is how to be confused. Marco chuckled, leaning back in his chair with a casual confidence. Well, Earth can be a bit overwhelming at first. But trust me, Zira, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Wait until you see how we really unwind. I'll introduce you to some games later. You'll have a blast. Zira's eyes widened. Games? Oh, you'll see, Marco replied, a mischievous glint in his eye. Earth has a lot of interesting ways of having fun. And you've barely scratched the surface. As the conversation continued around her, Zira did her best to follow along, though the constant double meanings and playful jabs left her more confused than ever. She tried to keep a straight face, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the underlying tone of the conversation. There was an energy here, a rawness, that was completely foreign to her. It was like nothing she'd ever encountered in her own culture. The group began to get more animated, their laughter growing louder as one of the humans, a man with a broad smile, leaned in and addressed her directly. So, Zira, he said, his words thick with implication, what do you think of Earth's physicality? Do you think we're all as flexible as we seem? Zira blinked, her mind racing to interpret the question. Flexible? She repeated, her voice uncertain. I do not know what you mean. The man laughed, clearly enjoying her confusion. Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean. He winked at her, a gesture that made Zira's discomfort grow tenfold. Marco, ever the facilitator, leaned forward and whispered to her. They're not being serious, Zira. It's all part of their humor. I do not find it humorous, she replied stiffly. Marco smiled, clearly amused by her inability to fully grasp the situation. You're too serious. You've got to learn how to laugh, Zira. Earth is all about laughing at the absurdity of it all. Zira frowned, trying to process the barrage of contradictions surrounding her. How was it that humans could talk so openly about things that were considered private or inappropriate in her culture, and yet they didn't seem to care? It was baffling. Her mind wandered back to the earlier moments, when she had watched the humans dance at the nightclub, their bodies moving with an ease and fluidity that was so different from her own rigid, reserved posture. She had tried to join in, but her movements had felt stiff and awkward, as though she were clumsy and out of place. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, much less the subject of someone's humor. But as she thought back to Marco's playful nudges, she realized that perhaps there was more to this than she had initially assumed. Perhaps this was the human way of connecting. Maybe their teasing, their innuendos, their offhand jokes, maybe it was their way of breaking down walls, of establishing rapport. Just as she was about to voice another protest, one of the humans at the table stood and clapped her hands. All right, enough talk. Time to show Zira just what Earth fun is all about. Zira's heart sank. She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever was coming next, but before she could protest further, Marco was already pulling her up from her chair. Come on, Zira. You're in for a treat. As she was led toward a different part of the club, Zira had no idea what to expect. She tried to brace herself, but every step she took seemed to pull her deeper into this whirlwind of bizarre human customs that made less and less sense to her. The line between cultural exchange and ridiculous antics was becoming more and more blurred. Marco, however, was clearly having the time of his life. He turned to Zira and gave her a reassuring smile, though she could see the mischief in his eyes. Relax, Zira. You're gonna love this. I promise you won't regret it. Zira sighed, trying to calm her nerves. She wasn't sure if she was ready to embrace this strange, chaotic human world, but at this point, it felt like there was no turning back. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to be learned here. Something she couldn't fully understand yet, but was beginning to suspect might just be the key to truly connecting with humanity. Whatever happened next, Zira was about to find out that Earth, with all its absurdity and contradiction, was going to challenge her in ways she hadn't anticipated. And despite her confusion, a small part of her, an unexpected, rebellious part, was starting to get curious. Could she truly embrace this new world? Could she let go of her carefully crafted composure and take part in the chaos? Only time would tell.